Lord, I invite you to just come, take over the words of my mouth, the meditation of our hearts, Lord. I pray that you would take over all our thoughts, our intellect, and move us and help us receive everything that you want to speak to us tonight, Lord. Help us to hear the sound of your voice this evening, Holy Spirit. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. So I was kind of marinating with this idea in my head for a little while, and I was so unsure about whether I should use this as a topic, okay, because this is most unbecoming for a person like me, because the topic here is actually obedience, okay, and responding, do whatever he tells you. And I'm the last person qualified to be speaking about this. But then when Pavani spoke about trust, it felt like God was confirming that this is almost like a follow up, like a part 2 message, if you please, to what she shared. And so yes, this is what we're going to look at. If you don't mind, I'm going to keep looking here because my notes are here. All right. So we talk a lot about, and actually it's not just talk, but we have a deep desire to have intimacy with God, to go on this great adventure with him, and to see more of the miraculous happen in our daily lives. And miracles happen when we respond to God in obedience. Another thought that has been on my mind so much of late has been the disciples. The people they were before they received the Holy Spirit versus the people they became after they received the Holy Spirit, and what kind of propelled them into that sort of momentum, because we all have the Holy Spirit, we've all been baptized in the Holy Spirit, and it seemed like they had some sort of radical obedience, and so it seems like obedience is vital to living the supernatural life that we read about in the pages of the Bible. So the other thing I discerned was, all of us, we live in a world that's drowning in individualism. Okay, and that makes it really hard to accept something someone says and comply with what they ask us to comply with, whether it's people, authority figures, whether it's institutions. It's always really hard for us to comply with these people because it always comes down to, if we are not able to understand, if we are not able to relate to what is being asked of us, if we can't trust the institutions or the people who are asking us to do these things. And personally, I've seen this happen a lot in my life, and I think when it comes to God also, we struggle on a fairly regular basis to obey. And the areas of obedience will be different in different people's lives. And I'm sure the areas we struggle to obey God in today look quite different from those areas that we struggled in yesterday or the year before. Another thing that's worth mentioning here is, obedience sounded like such a bad word. And I think Pavin and me have had this conversation in the past. And it felt like, that big bad word that was used as a ruler to, hammer you into shape. Like, you better get in line or else. And so I thought it was a word that was designed to oppress me and suppress me and kind of, keep me in the straitjacket, rob all the fun. And, so that's why I was really blessed with what Pav shared about trust, because I think so much of obedience, like one has to have that foundation of trust to be able to obey, and so that's why it was really interesting that she shared what she shared without us having any prior conversation. And so our trust falters, and so we fall short of wholehearted obedience. And so, yeah, because before we obey, we need to be able to trust the person. And man-made institutions, people, all fall short on a regular basis. But while human beings prove untrustworthy, God is always trustworthy. And that's again, something that Pavni mentioned, that number, 7,487 promises that he has made for us, and many more reasons than that he's proved himself trustworthy. And so therefore, it gives us every good reason to obey him under any and every circumstance. So, like the passage that was read today, there were three people, okay? One was a little group, but there were two other people in the passage that I would like us to look at. One was Mary, okay, Jesus' mother. And so I want to look at how each person responded, right, to this situation at the wedding. So Mary sees this shortfall and she completely relies on her son to take care of it. Like without even thinking, she says, just ask him to sort it out, go and ask my son what to do. And so I found this really amazing, this complete wholehearted trust that he's going to sort this out, okay? And this message that she gives the servants, do whatever he tells you, and it seems like that message is as valid for us today as it was to those servants at that point in time. Of course, and then there's Jesus, okay? Jesus responds by making a very puzzling statement. Woman, what does this concern? What does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. So I have puzzled over the statement for a while, okay? Because gentle Jesus, meek and mild, making statements like this have always made me really uncomfortable. So I first thought I'll skirt around this, but I said, no, I need to have an answer to this. So I went and looked up a few places. And it seems like woman was a typical address for women in the gospel. And it's sort of equivalent to when we use ma'am. So it's not as rude as we think it is. So Jesus wasn't really being rude. So though the tone is made to sound is a little abrupt in Greek when we read this translation in Greek, but it's not intended in that manner. So the point he was trying to make is that he was on a different mission. And actually this event took place right at the start of his ministry. Before he could enter his public ministry is when this event takes place. And so he's trying to tell his mom that this is not my journey. So this concern has nothing to do with what I'm here for. I'm here for a different purpose. And so he was trying to explain to her through the statement that he was getting into his public ministry now, and everything else, including family ties, family requirements, his personal requirements, everything was going to come second to his mission, that he was here for. And he was so clear about that. And Jesus was setting his agenda almost for public ministry, and he was taking his directions only from God, his Father, right? But at the same time, we see that though he's so focused, he makes this exception. He makes this exception for his mother, out of, I think, sheer respect and love for her. And he goes ahead and turns that water into wine. And the other thing that stood out for me here was also Jesus's incredible humility. I mean, you wouldn't get that from the statement, woman, what does this concern have to do with me? But he was actually being quite humble, because in the same breath, he said that this is not my job, but at the same time, he does it anyway. And there's something quite beautiful in that, and I think, again, it comes down to the relationship he shared with his mom and, something he wanted to do for her. And even though it was not yet time for him to reveal himself as a Messiah with public displays of his supernatural power. And the third most interesting group is are the servants, okay? Because I think this is where we can identify, because we are his servants, because Jesus himself became a servant and washed his disciples' feet. So we've been called into that that's part of our assignment. We are disciples and we are his servants. Um, so yeah, but unlike the servants in this story who had absolutely no clue who Jesus was, for all they knew, this is happening in Galilee. So for all they knew, he was just Mary's boy, So it would have puzzled them, like, what is he going to do about it? Does he have a vineyard we didn't know about? That kind of thing. And, but they go ahead and do it anyway. I think one, because they were servants and didn't ask questions. And two, because they were servants and didn't ask questions, So, and here are some really odd instructions that they get from Jesus, right? One, fill those 6 30-gallon water jars to the brim with water. And these jars were kept for washing feet. Now, the only thing noteworthy about these 6 30-gallon jars was going to be their future story. Okay. The fact that they were the vessels, they were going to be used as the vessels for Jesus' very first sign. And then the second instruction was, now go and draw some water, go and draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. Now these words, draw some out, indicate that while they were being drawn out, it was still water. Nothing had changed. What changed, the miracle that took place, was in their hands. And I think this a lot of us already know. But for them, I mean, any of us in that situation, it would have been so strange. What are we doing? We are servants. If we go and they want wine, if we go serve them water, I'm going to lose my job. I may be flogged. I don't know what, but they do it anyway, And, but yeah, but unlike the servants at Cana, we have every reason to believe that Jesus is so capable of moving in supernatural ways. When he asks us to do something and when we respond to the instruction he's giving us, he's entirely able to use it in the most supernatural, miraculous way possible. I read this really nice quote by Bill Johnson, which nailed it for me, what biblical obedience is. It's a little different from, I think, the way I understood obedience in my life. Obedience is not measured by our ability to obey laws and principles. Obedience is measured by our response to God's voice. That's quite cool, I thought. It's measured by a response to his voice. So again, it brings it back to, this relationship with him. So it's important to hear his voice in order to be able to respond to it. So, I'll close with a few lessons from this wedding at Cana. Okay, what can we learn? What can we glean from here? One verse that jumped into my mind was trusting in God with all our hearts and not leaning on our own understanding. When we are able to use that as a basic principle for everything in life, I think we can see the miraculous take place. Then, another very interesting thing I found in this passage was that oftentimes when God calls us to do something, it will take place in obscurity. In this situation, everything was certainly very obscure, because we see from the passage that although the wedding party got to enjoy this delicious wine that no human had ever tasted before, nobody knew where it came from. And Jesus quite intentionally kept that secret because he didn't want to reveal who he was at that point. So it was only Jesus, the servants, Mary, and his disciples who knew. The rest of that group had no clue what had just happened. So frequently when we are called to do something, we may be called to do it in obscurity. No one may know that we've done it. And that's going to call for humility. And the other thing was that obedience fast tracks us to a greater revelation of God's character, of his love. Now imagine these servants themselves, or even the disciples. It ends by saying the disciples, he revealed his glory and his disciples believed in him, because they suddenly saw something like, wow. I'm pretty sure those servants also ended up, there's something different about this guy. They must have gone away with that thought. Obedience also doesn't mean that our journey is always going to be smooth sailing or that we won't doubt, but that's okay with God. He just wants us to do it anyway. It's like, even if you doubt, just do it anyway. It's going to end well. You just got to trust me and it'll end well. Okay. And God's glory is revealed. Okay. So whenever we decide to do what he tells us to do, like the master of ceremonies says that you have saved the best until now. So Jesus' glory was revealed through that. Like, they tasted of the best. They tasted of heaven's wine, for crying out loud. No human has tasted that since that party. Okay. And here's another nice thing I heard Bill Johnson say. There is no such thing as an act of obedience that is powerless. Even the most insignificant act that we can think of, it may be making just a call to a friend whom you know, or a relative whom you know is going through a tough time, inquiring about them, praying with them on the phone, buying somebody less privileged a meal, or like in this time we've seen migrant workers that, lots of people have gone out of their way to provide for, share our resources with people we know are struggling, uh, even to things like, the fresh expressions on Friday, other things that everyone does, that football thing Pavni does with the children in Pune, and uh, LML in Bangalore, so many wonderful things that people are doing, those kind of things are, they any act of obedience releases God's presence and his power. And God's glory becomes manifest in our obedience. So eventually it does end well. God gets the glory, and we get to see God in a whole new way. So I came to the conclusion that, far from being oppressive, obedience is actually that key that unlocks the life of adventure for a disciple of Jesus Christ. And we're all that. All of us have been called to be his disciples. And it's also that same key that unlocks the abundant life in Jesus, because it's always God's version of obedience is always calling us out of the comfort zone. It's always calling us to do things that don't make sense, and a lot of the times it won't make sense. Like, filling water jars and taking wine out, and those kind of things. Bible is full of those kind of stories. But as disciples of Jesus, he's inviting us to do whatever he tells us to. And why does he do that? Because that's exactly how he lived his own life. He only did what he saw the Father doing. He never did anything of his own accord. So he led the way by being so obedient. And so that's where I'd like to end this.